There was a need for privacy reform because at the point that the original legislation was brought into place in 2001, the world was quite a different place. So at that time, we didn't have social media, we didn't have online data, we didn't have mobile data. And all of those things need to now be taken into account with the legislation that we have. So the Privacy Act has been reformed to take into account how businesses are collecting data and using this data in the current environment. So under the new Act, the Privacy Commission does have new enforcement powers, and this is one of the biggest changes under the new privacy legislation. There are three key areas to look out for. First of all, the Privacy Commission can now impose fines if there is a breach of the Privacy Act, and those fines are quite substantial. So they can go up to $1.7 million per infringement, and within an incident or within a privacy breach, there can be 2, 3, 4, 5 infringements, and that means the fines can ramp up quite quickly. The second area that the Privacy Commission has enforcement powers is called enforceable undertakings. And what that means is that the Privacy Commission can publicly put it out there that the company has breached and can ask the company to put in place compliance practices and procedures to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And that is quite costly, but it's also public and it will have an impact on your brand. The third thing to keep in mind with regard to enforcement is that the Privacy Commission can now proactively look at companies to see if they are complying with the legislation or not. So whereas previously it was complaints driven and it would have to be that a consumer complained about their privacy being breached, that's no longer a requirement, and the Privacy Commission can proactively go out to companies and ask them to demonstrate that they are complying with the privacy legislation. So the type of complaints that usually arise in relation to privacy and marketing are probably threefold. First of all, probably the highest level of complaints is where somebody has requested to opt out and the company hasn't adhered to that request. So that's probably the number one complaint that we get. The second type of complaint from consumers will be that they weren't notified how their data was going to be used. So it's really important that as marketers we're very clear, very upfront and very transparent about how data is going to be used, who it's going to be held by, if it's going to be transferred overseas. All of those things that would really concern a consumer. So the third area, the third real complaint that comes from consumers is around where companies got their data from. So often, data hasn't been given by the individual themselves. It may have come from a third party, and consumers need to understand where that data has come from. So they feel very uncomfortable when they ask a company where their data was actually acquired from, and the company doesn't answer that properly. So again, as marketers, we need to have in place processes, practices, procedures that make sure that if a consumer asks the question, where did you get my data from, that they can both be given an answer as to where that data came from and then transferred or put in touch with the company that originally held that data. So the main challenges for marketers under the new privacy laws, there's going to probably be three main challenges. First of all, we've got the introduction of what is called notification. So there's this requirement for companies to be proactively going out to consumers and telling them what is happening with their data. So who's collecting it, how it's going to be used, how it's going to be stored, if it's going to be disclosed to third parties. So there is this requirement to include this now within marketing communications or at the point that data is collected. And that's quite a big change that marketers are going to have to implement. The second area is going to be around the opt-outs. So whereas previously or under the current legislation the opt-out is worded in a certain way, under the new legislation opt-outs have to be much more specific, and we're recommending that they go on every single marketing communication across every single channel. The third real challenge will be for marketers is there are a number of little changes in the legislation, and they're the ones sometimes we've got to look out for. So it's not about the big substantial changes that we probably put a practice or a procedure around. It's about the little changes that come through around the definition of personal data, around how we have to store data, around making sure that individuals know that data is going overseas. So it's really quite important to go through a checklist so you've got all of those little pieces covered when you're looking at privacy, internal privacy practices and procedures. So my advice to organisations that are looking to privacy compliance, first of all, I would say you need to get a team of people involved internally. So don't leave this just to the compliance professionals. We need to have all parts of the business involved in making sure that compliance goes throughout the organisation. So of course you'll have a lawyer or a compliance person, but also bring in your marketers or your IT team or risk people, anyone that's going to be using personal data, so that they are involved in the design of compliance programs. The second piece of advice that I would give to organisations that have got marketing departments and marketing components is to start now reviewing your marketing collateral to make sure that you are complying with the new legislation. Make sure it's got the notification statements in there, that the opt-outs are right, that there's links to privacy policies, all those things that are now required under the new legislation. And it needs really a checklist. A checklist needs to be put in place for marketers so they can go through from top to bottom and make sure that all marketing communications comply with the new legislation. The third area that I would recommend that organisations look at or that they put in place is to have a privacy champion. So somebody internally who is constantly, can be the go-to person if a question comes up, or that can be looking for changes that are going to come into the legislation moving into the future. So that person can be tasked with making sure that internally within the organisation people know what they're doing, and they can be making sure that they're staying on top of changes moving forward. The fourth area, which I do think is really, really important, is to have an internal education program to make sure, again, that it's not just the compliance team that are on top of privacy responsibilities, it's everyone within the organisation. Because if everyone understands what they're meant to be doing, obviously it's much more likely that you're not going to fall foul of the legislation. So an ongoing internal education program would be something we highly recommend.